The studio lights burned bright that afternoon, too bright, almost, reflecting off the glossy floors of the Family Feud stage. The cameras rolled, the audience clapped in rhythm, and Steve Harvey's familiar stride carried him to center, stage, flashing that wide, confident smile that America had come to love. "Y'all ready to play?" he boomed, and the crowd roared in response. The Johnsons and the Myers families stood at their podiums, beaming nervously. It was another episode, another game, another chance at good-natured chaos and laughter. But among the Myers family, standing second from the left, was a woman whose presence seemed different. Her name was Tanya Myers. 42 years old, a middle school teacher from Birmingham, Alabama. Her smile was warm but subdued, her eyes bright but distant, like someone balancing between joy and something much heavier. She was introduced as the family peacemaker, the one who keeps everybody in line. The crowd laughed, Steve joked, and Tanya laughed too, but only just enough to keep up appearances. What no one knew, not the audience, not even the producers, was that Tanya was carrying a grief so raw it barely had words. 2 months before her appearance on the show, she'd buried her husband, Marcus, after a long battle with lymphoma. They'd been married for 17 years. The Family Feud application had been something they'd filled out together, back when he was still healthy enough to dream. Tanya almost didn't come. In fact, she'd cancelled twice before finally saying yes. Her sister, Denise, convinced her, "He'd want you to go, T. You two love this show, you can do it for him." And so she did. As the cameras rolled, Tanya tried to stay present, laughing when Steve teased her family, clapping when they scored points. But every now and then, her eyes flicked upward, as if checking whether Marcus might be watching from somewhere above the lights. Steve, ever the empath beneath the comedian, noticed her quiet demeanor early on. Between rounds, he leaned over to her and whispered, "You good, sweetheart?" She nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, just grateful to be here." He smiled and nodded back, reading something in her tone that he couldn't quite place yet. The first few rounds were classic Family Feud, light-hearted and fast. Tanya's family guessed foods you shouldn't eat in bed, things you forget when you're late to work, and the audience roared as Steve delivered punchline after punchline. Tanya laughed, genuinely this time, and even Steve caught himself watching her smile. It wasn't performative. It was the smile of someone remembering how to feel joy again, if only for a moment. Then came the round that would change everything. "All right," Steve said, shuffling his cue cards. "We asked 100 people." He paused for comedic effect. "Name something that reminds you you're still alive." The audience chuckled softly at the poetic nature of the question. The first 2 contestants hit their buzzers, shouting typical answers. "Coffee! Bills!" The crowd laughed. Then it was Tanya's turn. Steve turned to her with that teasing grin. "All right, Miss Tanya, what reminds you that you're still alive?" She hesitated. For the first time that day, her expression shifted, the brightness dimming as her hands began to tremble on the podium. The laughter in the room faded. She took a long breath. "You really want to know, Mr. Steve?" Steve blinked, immediately sensing the change in tone. "Yes, ma'am, I think we all do." Tanya's voice was soft when she finally spoke, but every word cut through the studio air like a confession. "When I wake up and realize I'm still here, and he's not." A silence fell so heavy you could almost hear the stage lights buzzing. The laughter stopped. The clapping stopped. Even Steve, who'd built a career on timing and recovery, froze. He didn't move. He didn't joke. He didn't even breathe for a moment. Tanya looked down at her hands, voice trembling but steady. "Every morning I still reach for him, and then I remember, but then I get up anyway. 'Cause I guess that means I'm still alive." Someone in the back of the audience began to cry. The rest followed, a soft murmur of emotion sweeping across the room. Steve exhaled slowly, lowering his cue cards. He walked closer to her, his usual boisterousness completely gone. "Baby," he said, barely above a whisper, You just took us somewhere we weren't ready to go." Tanya looked up at him, eyes glistening. "I didn't mean to. It's the truth." Steve nodded slowly, his throat tightening. He opened his mouth to speak but found he couldn't. Instead, he just looked at her, really looked at her, and in that instant, something in him broke too. He stepped forward and opened his arms. Tanya hesitated for a split second before stepping into them, and when she did, Steve wrapped her up in the kind of hug that wasn't for TV. It wasn't for applause. It was for two people. One who'd lost everything, and one who suddenly realized how fragile life really was. The cameras kept rolling, but nobody dared interrupt. 5 minutes passed. Not a word was spoken. Steve just held her, a grown man in a sharp suit, trembling with empathy, letting her cry into his shoulder. The audience didn't move. Even the floor director had tears streaming down her face. In that moment, Family Feud stopped being a game show. It became something else entirely, something sacred. And when Steve finally stepped back, eyes wet and voice shaking, he said softly, "Tanya, you don't even know what you just did." He didn't mean for the show. He meant for everyone in that room. The audience didn't clap when Steve and Tanya finally let go. They couldn't. It didn't feel right. What had just happened wasn't entertainment. It was something tender and human that you don't interrupt with applause. Steve stood still for a moment, staring down at the floor, his cue card still clutched in his hand but forgotten. Then he looked back up at Tanya. "You all right, sweetheart?" he asked quietly. She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I didn't mean to make a scene," she said softly. Steve shook his head slowly. No, baby. You didn't make a scene. You made a statement." He glanced toward the crowd. "Y'all hear me?" What she said? That right there was real life, the audience murmured in agreement, sniffling. Dabbing at their eyes with tissues and sleeves, Steve turned back to Tanya. "You know, I stand up here every day with families just like yours. We laugh, we joke, we act a fool. But behind all that, people got stories. People got pain. And what you just said." His voice broke slightly. "You just reminded me that life keeps going, even when it don't make sense." He looked off stage, clearly emotional. Can we cut for a second?" The producers hesitated. You didn't just cut a live taping of Family Feud. But the director, seeing the tears welling in Steve's eyes, quietly nodded. The cameras lowered, and the audience relaxed a little. Steve turned back to Tanya and put a hand on her shoulder. "You lost your husband, didn't you?" She nodded slowly. 2 months ago. Cancer." He took a deep breath, trying to steady his voice. "You were supposed to play this show together?" Tanya smiled sadly. He used to yell at the TV when folks gave bad answers." A few audience members laughed gently. "We filled out the application before he got sick. I almost canceled twice. But my sister said, 'You gotta go.' He'd want you to. So, here I am," Steve nodded. He looked out at the crowd and said, "Let me tell you all something. There are folks watching this right now who've lost somebody, and they think they're supposed to be done living when that person goes. But this woman right here," she stood up. She kept moving. "That's strength! That's faith!" The audience erupted in applause, not the wild game show kind, but something slow and reverent. Tanya smiled through her tears, and Steve just stood beside her, hands still on her shoulder. When they resumed filming, something was different. The questions didn't matter anymore. The laughter was softer, the energy changed. Tanya's family won the round, but no one seemed to care about the points. Every time she smiled, the entire room seemed to breathe a little easier. At one point, Steve turned to the camera between questions. "You know, sometimes I think God sends folks on this show just to remind us what matters," he said, half to himself. "It ain't the money. It ain't the fame. It's the people." After the show wrapped, Steve didn't go straight to his dressing room like he usually did. Instead, he found Tanya backstage, sitting quietly with her sister. She was still clutching the note card he'd given her during the break. His personal number, scribbled on it. "You were something else out there," he said as he sat down beside her. She smiled faintly. "I'm sorry I cried. I told myself I wouldn't," he chuckled softly. "Baby, that's what tears are for. They clean you out. You ever see rain hit the ground after a dry season? That's what that was today. You just brought rain to a whole room of dry souls." Tanya looked down, tears forming again. "I didn't know I still had that kind of effect." Steve leaned back, studying her face. "You do. You got a story that's gonna stick with people. Not because it's sad, but because it's true. That's what the world's starving for right now. Truth. He stood up and offered her his hand. Come on, Miss Tanya, let me walk you out. They walked side by side down the hallway, past the posters of laughing contestants, past the bright lights that now felt softer somehow. When they reached the stage doors, Steve turned to her. You keep living, you hear me? You wake up every morning and reach for him if you got to. But then you get up anyway. That's what he'd want. Tanya nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks again. Thank you, Steve, he smiled. No, thank you. You reminded me why I do this? The next morning, when the production team reviewed the footage, the room went quiet. The scene between Steve and Tanya was raw, uncut, and full of pauses that no one would dare trim. Normally a hug that long would have been edited down, but the producers agreed, it stays. When the episode aired a few weeks later, it didn't just trend, it exploded. Social media flooded with clips titled, Steve Harvey hugs grieving contestant for 5 minutes. What she said broke everyone. One comment read, I turned this show on for laughs. I ended up crying in my living room. Another said, she reminded me of my mom. I lost my dad too. I thought I was done smiling. Thank you, Tanya. Steve read those comments quietly that night, alone in his dressing room. He smiled, thinking of Tanya's trembling voice and the strength behind it. For the first time in years, he realized that Family Feud wasn't just about laughter. It was about people, their lives, their pain, their truth. He closed his laptop, whispered a quiet prayer for Tanya, and sat back in silence. Tomorrow, he'd go back out there and make people laugh again, but he'd never forget the woman who reminded him that even laughter grows out of loss. Months passed after the taping, but that moment between Steve Harvey and Tanya Mitchell, the 5-minute hug that brought an entire studio to stillness, refused to fade. The clip had gone viral across every platform imaginable. Morning shows replayed it, radio hosts discussed it, and countless strangers online confessed that it had made them cry harder than they had in years. But beyond the noise of the internet, something deeper had happened. People started writing letters, not just to the Family Feud studio, but directly to Steve himself. They weren't fan letters. They were confessions. I haven't spoken to my brother since our mom died. After watching Tanya, I called him today. I'm a hospice nurse. Her strength reminded me why I do what I do. My husband passed last year. I thought I was broken. Watching her made me realize I'm just healing. Steve read every single one. Some he answered personally. Some he kept folded in his leather notebook, carrying them with him from city to city as a reminder of what connection really meant. Meanwhile, Tanya returned to Memphis, unsure of how her life could ever feel normal again. She'd gone to the taping, thinking it would be a distraction, a way to laugh for a while. But she left with something else entirely. A new sense of permission to feel, to cry, to speak openly about her husband's death, instead of tiptoeing around it. Her sister told her the episode had touched millions. Her students' parents sent her messages saying, "You gave us strength." And yet, Tanya still found herself sitting at her kitchen table most nights, staring at her husband's empty chair, whispering his name under her breath. One Thursday afternoon, about 2 months after the episode aired, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. "Miss Tanya?" the voice said. She froze. She knew that voice. "Steve?" she whispered. "Yeah," he chuckled softly. "You thought I forgot about you?" She laughed, caught off guard by how warm it felt to hear him. "No, I just didn't expect you to call." "Well," he said, "I was thinking about you today. You know how sometimes God just puts somebody on your spirit? I figured I better listen." There was a pause. Then he added, "I'm hosting a segment next month on stories that remind us what love looks like when life gets hard. I want you to come back on the show. Tell your story, not the sad part, the living part." Tanya hesitated. "I don't know if I'm ready for all that." Steve's voice softened. "You already did the hardest part. You stood in front of the world and told the truth. The rest is just breathing." And so, a few weeks later, Tanya returned to the Family Feud stage. This time, she wasn't there to play. She was there to speak. The studio lights were softer that day. The producers had set up a single chair next to Steve's, no podiums, no buzzers. just a quiet space for conversation. When the audience settled, Steve began. A while back, a contestant came on this show and said something that stopped me cold. You might have seen it. You probably cried like the rest of us did. But what you didn't see was what happened after. He turned to Tanya, smiling gently. Miss Tanya, welcome back. She smiled nervously and waved to the audience, who greeted her with a standing ovation. Steve leaned forward. So tell me, what's life been like since that day? Tanya took a deep breath. It's been healing, she said quietly. People write me. Strangers stop me in grocery stores. They tell me they're praying for me, or that they finally went to therapy, or that they hugged their spouse tighter that night. I didn't expect that. I didn't know that being honest about pain could help people. Steve nodded slowly. That's what truth does, baby. It don't make the pain go away. It just gives it purpose. The audience hummed softly in agreement. Tanya continued, I still miss him every day. But now, when I miss him, I try to do something that would have made him smile. I started volunteering at the hospital where he got his treatment. I talked to families waiting on news just to remind them they're not alone. Steve grinned, his eyes glistening. That right there, that's ministry. You're turning pain into light. That's the kind of strength the world needs to see. After the taping, the Harvey's highlights team turned Tanya's segment into a longer feature. 5 minutes that changed millions. It aired nationwide. Within hours, donations poured in for cancer research, grief counseling programs, and volunteer groups across the country. But for Tanya, the greatest moment came a few weeks later. One of her husband's old friends, a man he'd lost touch with years ago, sent her a letter. I wasn't there when he got sick. I didn't get to say goodbye. But because of what you said, I finally forgave myself. Thank you for letting him live on through your courage. Tanya read that letter and wept. For the first time since his passing, her tears weren't from pain. They were from peace. Steve, meanwhile, continued to talk about her in interviews. On one late-night show, when asked about his most powerful moment on Family Feud, he didn't hesitate. There was a woman named Tanya, he said. Lost her husband. She came on the show trying to smile through it. I hugged her for 5 minutes straight. And for once, I didn't care about the cameras or the game. I just cared about her. That moment reminded me that sometimes the best thing you can do as a host, as a man, as a human, is just stop the show and show up for somebody. The audience applauded softly, and Steve nodded. That hug, it wasn't for her. It was for all of us. 'Cause sometimes we all just need to be held, even if just for a minute, to remember that life keeps going. Years later, Tanya still received messages from strangers who had seen the clip for the first time. Some were grieving, some were lonely, some were just looking for hope. Her answer never changed. Find your people. Hug them long. Tell the truth about how you feel, and never apologize for loving someone enough to hurt when they're gone. It wasn't a game show story anymore. It was something bigger. A quiet testament to the power of honesty, love, and the kind of humanity that cuts through the lights, the cameras, and the laughter. And if you were watching that day, the day Steve Harvey stopped the show, the day a grieving woman taught the world how to keep living, you knew you weren't just witnessing a television moment. You were witnessing what it looks like when two people, in front of millions, decide that compassion matters more than entertainment. And for 5 unforgettable minutes, that was enough.